Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. I'm here with my good buddies John Gerard, Neil Polachek, and Greg Sterling. What's up, y'all? How you doing?
Hey guys, what's happening?
Hey. All right, another big week in AI.
We
OpenAI
should call
this
it
week.
another big week.
What's that?
New show title, Another Big Week in AI.
Another
Yes.
big week. It is, as it always is. But this week was particularly curious because there were some financials that got leaked from OpenAI that is quite the story, where it shows that OpenAI is reportedly burning tens of billions of dollars as it races to build artificial intelligence or general intelligence (AGI). The big story is that they've burned $39 billion last year. And so, what happens when a company like that goes public? We've seen something similar with SpaceX, who has massive losses, although SpaceX is telling a different story. So, it's going to be a very curious time, and we'll dig into that story this week. At the same time, AI is becoming a lot more competitive. For the first time, ChatGPT's market share has fallen below 50%. Google Gemini continues to gain ground, and there's an interesting report about that. So we'll dig in on that front. And Apple is preparing what is purportedly to be the largest AI launch yet with rebuilt Siri. That's expected this September. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. And finally, Bernie Sanders has proposed something that would have the American public take ownership in AI companies. And if AI companies create trillions of dollars, shouldn't the American public benefit from that? So let's get into these stories here. The top story is OpenAI's massive losses. Let's start with the economics of that. I'll jump ball on this one. Who wants to take this one?
I think that's a John Gerard.
Well, it's funny. Maybe. I mean, I'll do the lead off. I usually like the nerdy tech stuff, but like this week, this was kind of dominant. And maybe it's because baked into this story is a threat that all of my cool nerdy tech stuff is going to get taken away from me because these guys run out of money. So that might be why I care about it. So look, the headline here, of course, is that, $39 billion loss from OpenAI last year. Some of it a bit suspicious, the usual suspects in terms of the build out of infrastructure and whatever. But some of it looks kind of funny and maybe shouldn't be a surprise given the reputation Sam Altman has for, being clever about the ways that things are accounted for. But it raises an important question here, especially as all these companies are looking at going public. The cost of getting this technology out to you and me and letting us play with it has largely been borne by private markets so far, by private investors, VCs, hedge funds, PEs that want in on the AI revolution. And one way to read what's happening is, well, they've finally gotten to escape velocity and they can go public, so all those people can make some of their money back. The other way to read it is that those guys are no longer willing to underwrite the losses, that they're basically saying, enough's enough. Like, you guys aren't showing the ability to actually generate profit. So we're actually not going to put any more money in to underwrite this interesting experiment. And who's next in line? The public markets, which is the way that this offer goes.
Or at least slow the burn.
Yeah, or at least slow the burn. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this, I mean, of course, incredibly reminiscent of .com, 1.0, like very similar dynamics in terms of, private underwriting. And then we're sort of done. Let's see if the public markets will take this burden for a while. I think the big question in my mind is, depending on how much these guys actually end up really raising in the public markets, it's going to be a needle mover in the markets in general. People are going to liquidate other assets in order to put money into these things, which has this depressing effect on the market at large. And is it even going to be enough money to keep up these burn rates for another 18 months or 2 years? And I think the answer is not clear.
So I see it a little differently, and I think about the place that Google, AWS, these established businesses that have tremendous cash flow can cover a lot of this upfront investment. Like, it's cool to be on the inside of the private side of OpenAI and anthropology. No, Anthropic.
Anthrop. Yeah.
But maybe investors are starting to think, well, wait a second, Siri's, we're going to talk about Siri in a minute, and Apple and what they're doing in AI. Like maybe this is a sort of retrenchment back to people thinking, well, maybe a better bet is to just keep buying more into Google because, as we talked earlier, they're gaining market share, and like I think there's some of that that's going to be people are going to be thinking about going forward. And Google has a business, obviously huge business outside of just the AI portion of their revenue, right? So it's a different ball game. It's pretty staggering when you think about the amount of money that is being spent in this space, and you have OpenAI, who is purportedly losing $39 billion last year.
That's way up from the year before. I mean, that's the other thing, is that was a massive jump from the previous year.
A lot of that is compensation, and even this week, interesting hire with Noam Shazir, who Noam Shazir just went to OpenAI from Google. Google paid $2.7 billion for character AI to license their technology. And with that deal, Noam Shazir went to Google, and now he 2 years later, he's now going over to OpenAI for, I'm sure, a giant amount of money.
The most expensive acqui-hire ever.
Yeah. And then 2 years later, he left, right? So, there's all this, there's so much fluidity, both in the employee side and also on the user adoption side. And the switching costs are low right now. It's phenomenal. Like how much money is being thrown at the market, and still the moat is not really there for any of these companies, other than maybe Google, who's powering Siri, which we'll get into in just a little bit, and they're also powering. They've got all the data, so that in itself is a moat.
The interesting thing about this point about switching costs and the commoditization of these foundation models is that, yes, they are kind of a quasi commodity. They're not all the same, but they seem to be sort of the same or have equivalent capabilities. But I find myself using ChatGPT and Claude, even though intellectually, I sometimes I'll use Grok very marginally, and every so often I'll use Gemini for something. But for the most part, it's ChatGPT and Claude, and I use them not interchangeably exactly, but in a complementary way. And that's what has developed for me. And so even though I understand that, I can go over to Gemini, I can use Grok, I can use Meta AI, I don't. And, I suppose if those platforms were to dramatically improve, maybe I would be more inclined to use Gemini or something like that. But there is this kind of groove and inertia that develops around the existing product that you've chosen, right? I mean, it's probably true for all of us. I mean, there was a point at which
AI lost share. I mean,
well, yes, but that was that right. The reason that OpenAI lost share is because they did a number of stupid things, and Sam Altman in particular said a bunch of stupid stuff. And people, once they had some people had experiences of bad hallucination and decided to do something else. But it's really, they've met a bunch of what I would call political mistakes. Anthropic was sort of trying to draw some red lines for the government, and the government was, there was a very high profile controversy there. And OpenAI showed up and said, "Oh, we'll do that. We'll do autonomous killing, and we'll let you do whatever you want with our technology." And that, a lot of people reacted very, very negatively to that. And there was a spike in Claude downloads, and people shifted to Claude. And once they shifted to Claude, they decided, hey, this is a really good product, and I'm going to stay here.
Anthropic took that as an opportunity also to create a prompt so that you could just enter this prompt into ChatGPT, get the output of that, drop it into Claude, and now you have the memory in Claude that you had in Chat.
And I think if we zoom out here, there are real financial constraints here, right? There's not an infinite supply of money to support these businesses indefinitely, the Anthropics and the OpenAIs. And Neil, I think you have had a really important point at the beginning here around, it's probably the incumbents that are okay in all this. So whatever we think about using OpenAI versus Claude versus Gemini, if it's OpenAI versus Claude versus Gemini, I'm choosing Claude. If it's OpenAI versus Gemini, I'm choosing OpenAI. If it's only Gemini, I'm choosing Gemini. You know what I mean? So and then the other thing to kind of to make note of here is, so 39 billion obviously seems like a big deal to you and to me, but who can absorb that kind of loss is somebody like Google. Like Google had net profits in their most recent annual report of 160 plus billion, and so it's not like that 40 billion is nothing, but it's a quarter of their annual profits. Like, they could quite easily, and I'm sure they've talked about it, absorb OpenAI and all of its losses, and not cripple their own net income story, which is just crazy to think about from a scale perspective. Now, there's all kinds of antitrust stuff associated with that, but it's like, okay, private markets don't want to fund this anymore. Public markets are only going to fund it for some shorter amount of time. There's my thumbs up. And so then what? What's next? Like who's going to line up to fund it next? And I think we've talked about this before, and I know we're going to talk about it later this show. I think that Sam Altman and even Anthropic to some degree, Dario, whatever his name is,
Amaday,
are angling or sort of setting the table for an eventual government bailout, right? Like, hey, this is too important to the success of the U.S.
Sarah Fryer, CFO of OpenAI, has already talked about that. She already talked about that, and and then everybody walked it back because it raised these alarms. That
this bailing out the airlines,
the
auto industry. I mean, we have a history of it.
But I mean, to the extent that the whole economy is dependent upon these AI companies now, or the stock market rather, as Andy was saying, that becomes a real thing. Not to steal your thunder, but let's segue into the market share conversation, because I think this is relevant. There have been a number of reports that have come out simultaneously: Sensor Tower, SimilarWeb, the Pew Research folks, and then of course there's always the stack counter data around, and they kind of directionally show the same thing. There's some differences, and they measure slightly different things. Some of them are measuring traffic referrals, some of them are measuring usage, visits to those platforms, some of them are the Pew data is self-reported survey data, but they all show basically that OpenAI ChatGPT has lost share over time, and the Sensor Tower data shows visits to ChatGPT versus other platforms now are down to below 50%. Their market share, measured by not engagement, not time spent, but visits, is now below 50%. And Gemini is the primary but not exclusive beneficiary of that. Claude also. So it's Gemini and Claude that are taking share from ChatGPT. And so if the markets perceive ChatGPT to be losing momentum, it's going to be hard for them to keep generating investor interest, whether it's private or public.
Yeah.
It's not the people that are going public, that's for sure. And when you have these kinds of losses, one of the interesting analogs, I suppose, in this market, it would be SpaceX, right? SpaceX just had what I would call a successful IPO. Their stock keeps going up, and since the IPO, and last year they had $20 billion in losses, but their story is different, and it doesn't have this circular kind of $100 billion kind of thing that's happening like it is in AI. So, for example, this $100 billion circular thing that's happening is where Oracle invests $100 billion into OpenAI, that invests $100 billion into NVIDIA, that invests $100 billion back into Oracle, or whatever. There's this like circular thing that's happening there, and that's what is ultimately powering this microeconomy in this environment. And so I get you're building this infrastructure. I understand that these deals are important for this infrastructure to stand up, and these are complementary partners to make it happen. That all makes a lot of sense. SpaceX doesn't have that kind of story, and their story is a little bit different. Their story is sort of like, well, what's the revenue opportunity on opening up the market to a different planet or the future story. And Elon Musk seems to have this this model where he goes to market, and I don't know, OpenAI doesn't really have this story, but Elon's model has always been, there's an immediate story of changing the market and disrupting the market, whether it's cars, but then it's future robo taxis, and then it's really future with robots, and sort of this layered kind of story of there's
And more Starlink in there too.
long term, where OpenAI, they don't really have that kind of story right now, where, and it's certainly not clear, but they're spending a lot of money acquiring talent, and so right now their story is 100% dependent on what's happening in this immediate short-term environment, which isn't a good look when you're losing $39 billion.
Yeah, their story is we're a chat.
Yeah.
Starlink is a real business.
Yeah.
Well, we can debate the valuation of SpaceX, but they do have a legitimate business that people are paying for, and that's Starlink. And that is at least something these other guys don't have.
Well, ChatGPT and OpenAI does have revenue, and they've got a lot of revenue coming in. So, that is obviously their story, but it's not clear. Like, they don't have this short-term, medium-term, long-term with the moonshot,
They don't have a
thing.
story like that they're able to convey. Like if you ask somebody what OpenAI does, you probably get, well, they're a chat bot. If you ask somebody what SpaceX does, you're like, well, they're going to get us to Mars. Like they have very different narratives sitting behind them.
So the ChatGPT version of that is less sexy. It's diversified revenue, enterprise, advertising, and consumer subscriptions. But it's not a today, tomorrow, and the future kind of argument that Elon Musk is making. Elon Musk is a kind of carnival barker, basically. There's this aura of the genius around him, and a lot of people buy into that. But he rarely delivers against his promises, let alone on time. But people are mesmerized by this infinite potential. He's got a couple of real businesses, Tesla and SpaceX, in that mix, and then he's got a data center AWS play that's emerging. XAI is nothing. Twitter is nothing. The robotaxi business hasn't materialized.
55 robo taxis out in the market.
It has not materialized. Maybe it will certainly not achieve the ambitions that he expects for it. And then the idea of putting, the humanoid robot business is very speculative. I mean, humanoid robots will exist and do things, but it's probably not as big a market or as soon a market as he's arguing.
10 billion robots that will be humanoid robots that will be in the market by 2030. That he just said.
Yeah, that's not going to happen at all. And then this putting people on Mars is a complete, at least in the near term, it's a complete fantasy. There may be some settlement on Mars, but it's certainly not going to be 1 million people by date X that he's talked about. But yet people buy this. They're just like, oh my God, he's a genius. He's they're buying. It's like a collective delusion where I'm going to bet on Elon because everybody else is.
I think that's true. I also think that there is a certain genius there that is kind of undeniable. Like I think about a lot of people say, well, gosh, he didn't even start Tesla. And that's true. But to take Tesla from where it was to what it is, or what it's achieved just in terms of sheer distribution of electronic vehicles, the supercharger network, that's, love him or hate him, it's best in class, it's game changing. There is a certain genius there. Or take the second stage rockets, like landing back on the launch pad. That's like science fiction stuff right there.
But he's not the source of that. He is the figurehead behind whom there are some very, very talented people who are executing on his behalf.
Who I think, what I would argue, are aligned behind him to do it. Like that's the part. Like, I'm just not sure these things would have happened.
It doesn't happen accidentally, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look, I don't particularly, I mean, I don't know what to think about the guy. But I think about, like, when I think Carnival Barker, I think like, Elizabeth Holmes, like here's this fancy thing, but it doesn't work at all. Like, it doesn't.
Tesla is a very important company.
Yeah.
It's a really important company. And it almost single-handedly launched the electric vehicle industry. It moved a whole industry, and I give him complete credit for that. And he is a compelling storyteller to
Yeah.
people.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is his genius, if there is any, is that he is able to tell stories that people buy into and believe in. And to some degree, he's got a vision.
Yeah. There's a certain kind of genius. And tying this all back to the AI stuff, right? I mean, so, like, you could argue he has made the case that a Tesla is actually just a four-wheeled robot, that is animated by AI. That's maybe not a totally unfair characterization of it. And then, of course, he has the optimist sort of thing. So this kind of convergence or confluence of AI and robotics is pretty interesting. And by the way, I don't know if you guys talked about this last week, but OpenAI quietly starting a robotics division may be the most interesting thing that's actually gone on for them in recent weeks. Even with all the kerfuffles around their 39 billion in losses, and all of our conversation just now about being kind of pigeonholed into chat and LLMs, like, that's where something really interesting does happen down the line. Wasn't something we even identified as a topic for this conversation, but as long as we're talking about robotics and such, like that seems to be an interesting plot twist.
There has to be some future telling for OpenAI that they're going to have to start disclosing about where the company's going, what they're doing, whether it's robots or whether it's wearables or whether it's some sort of infrastructure play or something else beyond what they're currently doing, the revenue that they're generating. It's not an advertising solution. I don't think the market really cares about that. And if you look at Snap, that's, they're going to get pitches to, like, you're like, Snap. Okay, fine. Got it.
I think the advertising story is a compelling one, but it's not compelling enough. I totally agree with you that there needs to be some long-term vision that people really believe in and buy into to suffer through these losses that are going to keep happening for the foreseeable future.
People are buying a business that has $39 billion of losses for an advertising play. Nobody needs another advertising play.
Yeah.
Really.
Once again, circling back. I mean, we've talked before about all this hand-wringing about Apple, and I know we're going to talk about Siri's new thing here too. Missing the boat on AI, and I think we said it right here. It doesn't matter. Like, the brand and
Distribution
revenue they have and distribution they have. They could sleep on it for another year and still be fine. And indeed, and again, this is sort of jumping the gun a little bit.
No, let's move into it. That's
the segue right there. So let's talk about that. So Apple just announced in their conference the other day that there's going to be a new version of Siri that comes out finally, and it's going to be powered by Google, which is like an interesting twist, right? So yeah,
I think, by the way, I think the way that they framed it is they said Apple Intelligence. This time we mean it.
Yeah, right.
So is that Gemini on my phone? Is that Gemini in my app?
No. They've used Gemini to distill what they're using. I mean, I can't speak the technical side of this. Maybe Andy or John can, but Gemini is like the Intel inside, and they built stuff on top of it. And you're not going to see Gemini branding. You're not going to see Google branding. And they're doing additional things privately
to make it better.
In theory, to make it better. Yeah. And the early reviews on the sort of beta developer download are mixed. Much better than the short version is much better than what exists today, but still has a long way to go, is what I've seen. And
well, you can't fall off the floor.
But what was most interesting about
I've never heard that term. That's a good term.
what was most interesting about the developer conference keynote was that previously they announced these changes and then they didn't deliver them and they got sued for it and everybody started saying it's vaporware and they lost a bunch of credibility, which is why their stock took a hit that you alluded to in the green room. But what they did when they started talking about Siri is they had a handset and they were doing live demos. They were doing live demos, not showing an animation, not showing a video. It was like, here's a real-time demo. This is a real thing, right? To convince people that it was real this time.
Yeah, but by the way, just you're mentioning that the technical notes on this, and this actually is pretty important. It essentially they're doing it exactly the way that we described it maybe a year ago, which is they're exposing data from first the core iOS apps to this orchestrator layer. So that's the AI agentic, powered by Gemini layer here, so that it has visibility into things like my text messages and what the actual content of those are. And it has the ability to kind of query against them. Think of it like an MCP style query against the stuff that's already on my phone. And then they've created this additional sort of layer or standard for all third-party app developers to expose their data and their actions to this orchestration layer, so that now the orchestrator can have perfect visibility into everything on my phone via the apps that I'm using. So now this version of Siri can see every single app that I have and all of the data in that app to the degree I've given it permission to. And so can now do things like, oh, you've got a trip coming up tomorrow. You've got a to-do item to book your lodging. I checked your bank account and you only have 17 cents in it as usual. You're going to have to make some adjustments in order to book your lodging, right? So that's pulling that information from multiple places and helping drive a smart decision. So it's exactly the way they've set it up. And again, because they've already got all those relationships and all those apps are already on the phone, all they had to do is snap their fingers and say, now developers, go build this and expose your data in this way. And they can do all of it in ways that nobody else can.
Well, and so like today I use Claude and I say, go into my email and find this stuff that it takes me hours to go find. Now, like I use Gmail. Am I going to be able to do that in Siri?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
So it'll open all those things.
And seamlessly, right? So like right now, if you want that in Claude, you have to install the connector. You have to enable it, authenticate it, all that kind of stuff. Right. Like in Apple, it'll be in iOS, it'll be the same as like when something requests health permissions. You just say approve all. Now all of a sudden, every single app I have on my phone is automatically connected to that AI orchestrator or orchestrator with sort of full visibility into my whole world.
I mean, I think that the developers have to do some work on the back end to enable that, but that's going to be seamless to the end user.
It's going to be seamless. And by the way, they're used to doing that. Apple has already trained them that every time a new iOS release comes out, they have to do something new. Hey, we now have widget architecture and you need to, build your next version of your app to this new widget methodology or architecture structure that we have. Hey, we've got now the ability to publish an icon in the notch or to do live actions or whatever it is. Like they've already trained the entire developer community to plan their development cycles around iOS's updates. And this is just the latest update.
So 2 quick points. So the first point is that this is a search alternative to Google because they talked about having world knowledge, and that's going to be part of the mix. I mean, they've had a version of that before with Siri Spotlight, but it's been pretty weak. It's not really a substitute. There's been all this talk about Apple developing a search engine over years. All of this information came out at the antitrust trial. They were flirting with it, but Google was basically bribing them not to do that with their $20 billion in annual payments to be the default search engine. This now does represent a legitimate threat to certain percentage of searches on Google, because Siri's going to search your phone and answer that question, drawing upon quote unquote world knowledge. It'll probably be top of the funnel informational queries, but nonetheless, those are things that Google won't get. The other thing is the distribution point. Okay, there we are. Apple has this privileged position because they have all your personal data. It's this device in your hand all the time. They are like Google in that they have this massive distribution that nobody's going to displace that. Nobody's going to displace that. The only displacement is if you buy an Android phone and then you're in the Gemini ecosystem. But
Wow.
because of its privileged, this raises some antitrust implications that the Europeans will probably get into. It's going to be, you're going to be using Siri. If it works half decently, you're going to be saying, "Hey Siri, what was that email? Hey Siri, who wrote that song? Hey Siri, when does the game come on?" or whatever it is, and you're going to be going to that again and again and again, and not going to Google, and maybe not going to OpenAI, or whatever alternative you might have used before.
Word has it that Apple's going to be paying Google an additional $1 billion a year.
$1 billion. $1 billion.
For this functionality, that's in addition to their $20 billion that they pay them for search
Does that
functionality.
seem like a steal?
It kind of does. I mean, I guess we'll see.
They're just going to get it.
want the
Google's just going to, it's just going to be like a discount. If Google's still paying Apple all this money to be the default search provider, then they're just going to be paying them $1 billion less, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on how much how that impacts Google's traffic. Currently, none of this is really impacting Google's traffic as much. Google's traffic is increasing right now, so don't really know. And I guess we will see what the impact of that is, Greg. I don't know. If I would imagine you're right. Like a lot of these simple queries that people have, they'll just do them on their phone and ask Siri. But I think there's some trust that needs to be rebuilt. The big question is, what happens in the market? Does this new Siri end up selling more iPhones or not? And that's really what the market cares about. This week, when that announcement was made at the WWDC conference that Apple had, shortly after that, their stock dropped 2%, right? Wiped out about $300 billion of value in their stock because the market thought it was weak, and the market thought that they're not sure if that's going to sell more iPhones. And so, that's the big question from the market standpoint. From a strategic standpoint, it feels like Claude is trying to become the operating system for work, whereas Siri is trying to become the operating system for your life. And this is a theme that we've talked about a lot on the show.
But those two are pretty closely aligned. I mean, it's hard for me to separate them that well. I don't know about you guys.
The connector, kind of strategy is a really it's a really compelling one. And a big part of what's missing in this market is, ChatGPT is kind of like not they're not showing up with connector capabilities and integration capabilities to create that kind of a moat where once you have all of these apps connected into a core platform, that creates switching costs. Now you have to uproot from where you've already integrated all these systems into one place. So again, going back to ChatGPT, I don't really know what their moat is. Whereas you definitely see Claude building this moat. Clearly with Siri, they're trying to create, further moat and using the data that they have. Google absolutely is creating the moat with all the functionality that they've created around all the data that they have and the functionality that they have with Gmail and Search and all of the Google Workspaces tools. So, it's really interesting to kind of look at these market moves and what's happening and who's seeing early success at this stage in the market.
Yeah. And I think one other thing to add to that, exactly what you said, is that the different approaches that especially the bigger guys are taking to these problems are just so characteristic of them as organizations and kind of culturally who they are. Like Apple has done this by having and maintaining a walled garden, and just holding on to that at all costs. And that's how they can instantly turn on connectors across every single third-party app, because they have invited everybody into this walled garden and said, you're going to do it our way. You know what I mean? And Google, meanwhile, has shown historically, and in this case, this just incredibly nimble, capability to pull on threads and do things in really complex and nuanced ways to kind of solve the same problem. And the simplest example of that I can think of is this experiment that they're doing with a daily summary email in their kind of AI offerings that I've been getting for a while now, that basically leverages what they can see in my email, that, by the way, has little summary updates and whatever from most of the apps that I use, because most apps that I use send me emails about new features or about my summary or about my bank balance or whatever. So they're actually leveraging that data stream that's kind of messy and not original, not well structured, not intended for to be ingested and presented this way, but they do it in a beautiful way. So it's like very interesting to see how each of them is sort of behaving in the way that you would expect them to behave, based on who they are and how they operate, culturally and technically in this moment.
And as we've talked about quite a bit, is that trust is the underlying factor as to how you're going to adopt certain platforms or not adopt certain platforms, as evidenced by the loss in market share that OpenAI has experienced recently. So
Yeah.
very interesting market moves. We're gonna let's wrap this up for today. But I will leave with a cliffhanger for us to pick up for next week, which Bernie Sanders is proposing that that the American public should own a percentage of these AI companies. And the question is, does that become is that foretelling to a bailout kind of scenario? Or his argument is that public research funded much of the underlying technology and taxpayers paid for that infrastructure to begin with.
Didn't we own part of SpaceX too?
Yeah.
Government gave him a ton of money, ton of
Yeah.
subsidy. NASA, all that stuff. Come on. We should
So,
own part of
we'll unpack that one on the next episode. But great conversation today, guys. Thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. And like, share, subscribe, all the good stuff. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
See you
All right.
later.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.